G'day everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to discuss planning for the summer ahead, with a particular focus on irrigation and water management. My name is Clinton Muller. I work with RM Consulting Group, and we deliver the National Vegetable Extension Network project, VegNet, in Victoria, the Northern, Western and Southeast regions. The VegNet project is about ensuring growers have access to available research and development funded through the Vegetable Levy, managed by Hort Innovation with co-contribution from the Australian Government. As we come out of a challenging 2019 spring in Victoria, we've seen widespread below average rainfall, warmer than average daytime temperatures, and all types of weather, including dust storms in the northwest, late November snow on the Alps, and fires in the far east. It's timely to take stock and check in on water management and irrigation planning for the summer ahead. We're very fortunate to be joined by a great lineup of presenters today who'll be sharing forecasting tools, future-based planning on water system availability, and the tips and tools to get through the summer with helpful reminders of your irrigation system. I'm joined on the line today with Graham Anderson from Agriculture Victoria. Graham's going to be discussing climatic outlooks and available tools and resources that are available for growers through Agriculture Victoria. George Vaughan from RMCG will be touching on water systems in the north of the state, with a particular focus around water pricing and forecasting. And Dr. Kelvin Montague from the Integrated Crop Protection and Soil Wealth Project will be providing some tips on managing irrigation for vegetable crops over the summer months. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get underway. For those who have not joined a webinar before, this is a 1-hour discussion and it's being recorded and will be made available on both the AusVeg Vic and Integrated Crop Protection and Soil Wealth websites, so you can watch again or share with those who couldn't join the session live. For those who are available to join us live, I really would encourage you to participate and fire away with your questions. How do you ask a question? You can easily do this by typing a question into the question tab on the GoToWebinar toolbar. This should have popped up on your screen. What I'll be doing is I'll take 1 or 2 burning questions for each speaker, but we're going to make sure we've got some good time at the end of the discussion to ensure a good round of question and answers. As we've got a packed agenda for this session, we'll get things underway, and I'll pass the screen over now to Graham Anderson from an Agriculture Victoria Climate Specialist. Graham's going to share some details on the seasonal outlook and how to access and use the available forecast tools to help with your planning for the season ahead. So, Graham, great to have you on the line today.
Yeah, thanks, Clinton, and welcome everybody. Good to be able to run through the state of the climate. So you're hearing that okay, Clinton? Can see the slide?
Very much so, Graham. It's great.
All good. All right. Well, just quick background for where I'm from, Agriculture Victoria, and I lead our climate seasonal risk team. So some people might be aware of the Break newsletter, which is monthly commentary on seasonal forecasts for Victoria, as well as the soil moisture monitoring work that's happening there, and different climate webinars as well. So we do the rounds and speak to a lot of people around the place, all trying to make sense of forecasts and what's happened and where we're heading to next. So good to share a bit of that with you today, plus a few new tools. Just speaking of tools, I'm just talking about, I want to refer to this, the climate app, which is from the Australian Managing Climate Variability Program. So you can see that climateapp.net.au. It's a ripper. You can use it at your desktop or as an iPhone or iPad app. But it's a really good little tool. When you go into it, there's hundreds of rainfall records. You can get one that's nearest your location, and I've just plugged in Shepparton Airport, and looking at rainfall and season progress this year. So this is, if you're looking at the graph here back from January, all of these lines here are individual years in the past, and the blue line is the long-term average through the centre. And this red one is just basically progress through the year at the moment. So we're certainly down there in the drier end of things at Shepparton. But it's a really good tool just to keep tabs on what's happening. And as you can see on the map there, there's hundreds of locations where you can keep track of local things. And there's lots of other little queries and tools in there that you can do with that. So I recommend that climate app. So the story this year, this is January, since 1st of January up to the 30th of November rainfall. And now this is in deciles for what rain we've had. Basically, where you see the white, that's close to average rainfall. And you can see there's not a lot of Australia that's had close to average. We have a little pocket in Western Victoria. Decile 2 to 3, which is basically in the driest, historically in the driest sort of 20 to 30% of years. Decile 1's the driest 10% of years. We can see a bit of that there. And then this darkest red is the lowest on record. So you can see some patches there for this year. Even though we've had a dry year or two around the place, there's been some quite remarkable areas of inland Australia that's quite dry, which of course probably partly sets up for, if the wind's in the right direction over the summer, there's plenty of dry and warm country that could head our way. I just want to point out this area of wetter up here. Majority of that would all happen in 1 week of pretty intense rainfall and weather in the first week of February in 2019, and so that's the Julia Creek and the floods and everything is up there with this big stationary weather system that sat there for a whole week. And so that was not a lot of fun for those that were caught up in that either. So certainly a lot of variability happening in Australia this year. Another tool I point to, this is the Bureau's Water and Landscape. It gives updates basically on root zone soil moisture across the whole country, but I've just got Southeast Australia here. You can interrogate that a bit deeply. This is compared to average, so root zone soil moisture as of today, and you can sort of see a few areas average. West Gippsland, a bit of the Otways is slightly wetter, but most places are a bit drier than normal for this time of the year. And you can see here just up in some of our catchments there that they're down to about 15% soil moisture profile. But you can see when you put in comparison to along the east coast there, where there's some, lowest 1% of records or driest on record, you can just see the condition where all of those fires are burning. There's some very dry conditions there that are fueling all of that. And just talk a little bit about seasonal forecasting. And one of the things is the key ingredient to making rain is you've got to have moisture in the air. You've got to have a good source of moisture, tropical moisture. And that's the key ingredient, because if you haven't got that, you can't make it rain. The first bit, you've got to have a tropical source of moisture. The second bit is then something's got to make that moisture fall out. But if you look at this is just a global map of total precipitable water. And you'll notice that, most of the precipitable water is along the equator. And that's because it's the warmest part of the planet. It's where the oceans are warmest and they're generating lots of moisture. So seasonal forecasters pay close attention, especially along the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, just to see where is all of the warmest ocean temperatures popping up, because that's often where a lot of the extra cloud and moisture will go. And you'll notice this one, you can see off to the west of Australia. There's a bit of a hole in some of the moisture there, and there's a lot more moisture over on the African side of the Indian Ocean, and that's largely because of a thing called the Indian Ocean Dipole. That year, there's been a lot more of that moisture dragged out. And in fact, the monsoon is still sort of hasn't. It's normally moving into northern Australia this time of the year, but it's delayed this year. It's still being caught up out there. So that's one of the reasons of why it's been drier and why it's probably still likely to be dry in the current outlook. I like this picture. This is, if you look at this little area of southeastern Australia where I'm hovering my mouse, but it's a great picture of the southern hemisphere and the key drivers that are behind our wetter and drier seasons. And I'll talk about up at the equator here, and you've got the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a really key driver of wetter or dry years. Some years it's sending us a lot extra moisture. The trade winds blow towards Australia and bring lots of moisture with them, but some years they can bring a lot extra, like in years like 2010-11 with the big La Nina year. And some El Nino years, like 2015, all of that moisture is out on the other side of the Pacific, and the trade winds are going backwards. Very hard to get moisture to feed into our weather patterns down in Southeast Australia when those El Ninos are on. The Indian Ocean Dipole, again, it's been the key culprit this year in terms of, most of the moisture's been over on the western part of the Indian Ocean, and a lot of a lack of cloud in this area off Indonesia and Sumatra. They've got a lot of fires and issues up there too. And it affects them greatly, but it basically means less moisture feeding into our northwest cloud bands that hits the cold air down south. And you can see all of these cold fronts that whiz around the Southern Ocean. That's the southern annular mode. And it's that combination of the triggers of the cold air, and then when it's hitting good moisture streams coming from the north, that gives Southeast Australia some of its reliable rainfall. So they're what a lot of the seasonal forecasters are looking at. This is just showing what's happened this year so far. The El Nino largely has been sort of just in neutral. So there's been no El Nino, La Nina sort of happening. It's just sort of in between. But the Indian Ocean Dipole has been a really strong event in terms of its drier phase. So again, most of the cloud was out in the Western Indian Ocean, and there was a lack of cloud moisture over here. So it normally finishes when there's an IOD event by now, but it's a pretty strong one, and it's just still going to feed into the start of summer, but it'll return to neutral by the end of summer, hopefully. One thing just this year, the southern annular mode and that frontal activity, certainly parts of Victoria have benefited because the southern annular mode's been in what they call a negative phase, which means the fronts have been blowing a bit stronger to Victoria's coastline. So southwest Victoria and West Gippsland, those places have offended better than a lot of places because of that annular mode. So, and I'm just going to point to this side. It's a new local climate tool that Forecast for Profit is the website. There's a few sites across Victoria and southern New South and South Australia that are on that. But this is an example of rainfall history from Alexandra in the Golden Catchment in Victoria. It goes back to 1900. The colours here are basically years when these climate drivers are in either neutral or a La Nina, El Nino in the Pacific, or when the Indian Ocean Dipole is in a negative phase, which is wetter phase, or in its dry phase like this year. And you'll notice here that while the average rainfall is 700 mil at Alexandra, there's some really dry years, you know, the 82 and 2006, 2015. You'll notice they're actually combination years of both an El Nino happening in the Pacific, which is cutting off moisture supply, but also teaming up with an Indian Ocean Dipole off to our northwest of Australia. They're also cutting off moisture supply. So traditionally our bigger droughts are when you know, one or both of those oceans aren't playing ball and sending us plenty of moisture. And that's what, in some seasons, there's a really good heads up on that for seasonal forecast. And some years it actually isn't as predictable as we'd like. If you look here too, in 2016, that was a wetter year. The IOD was in its wetter phase, sending good moisture. And that 10-11, pretty wet year, it was a combination, La Nina in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean Dipole in its wet phase. So it's interesting, you can go to that site and look at a site that's near you just to see how those drivers have affected you in the past. There's a lot of work going on to try and improve seasonal forecasting, and a bunch of industry programs that are teaming up with the Bureau to help improve this. So there's better stuff coming in line. I just want to point to the Bureau has recently updated its climate outlook overview. It's a pretty good site. There's an outlook video there which is worth looking at, gives you a summary of what's going on. And the current outlook basically is a bit of a, for the next 3 months, drier in the east and warmer than average. I'll go into it in a bit more detail because they've just added some new products, and one of them is about multi-week forecast. So there's not just a 3-month outlook, but there's a 1-month outlook or you know, weeks 2 to 3 you can look at. And so if I currently just did that this morning and you're looking at, say, the week of December 14 to 27, it pops up a map like this. So trying to understand these maps is important because weather forecasts, you know, out to 7 days are where they call them deterministic forecasts, where they basically tell you, you know, it's going to be this many degrees, and this is what direction the wind will come from, and you know, how much rain you may or may not get. So, but when it comes to probabilistic forecasts, once you get beyond 1 week and you're into week 2, 3, month 1, 2, 3, no one actually knows what's going to happen. So they run the forecast models, and based on how the oceans are set up and the pressure patterns, those models, they run them through for 3 months, and then sometimes you can see those models start to really, you know, strongly skew towards drier or wetter. So, and I'll give an example here for December 14 to 27. You can see this darker patch here. It's saying that basically, you know, there's a 20% chance of exceeding median rainfall. So what that means is they've run the model 100 times, and 80 of them are drier than average in that from the 14th to the 27th, and there were 20 that were wetter than average. So it doesn't guarantee that it's not going to rain. It's just that the models, that's a pretty strong signal for saying that, you know, they've run most of those models and there's not a lot of moisture to play with. So that's the important thing with probabilistic forecasts, is that no one actually knows what's going to happen. It's just based on that skewing of how the models play out depending on how the oceans are set up. So that's the current bureau. It's a good site to look at, and again, the explainer videos they do a really good job of. So the 3-month sort of outlook is for drier in the east and a bit of moisture finally starting to appear back, but most of that in the western side of the country. And also from a temperature point of view and maximum temperatures, that outlook is for a warmer summer. I guess that's sort of to be expected given the dry, but also we've got a broader background trend. These are maximum temperatures back to 1910, and you can see the maps for each decade. The blue is the sort of cooler than the long-term average, and the yellow to orange is much warmer than the long-term average. So it's just running through the different decades. You can see the 40s there. And you can see while we've got a lot of variability that's sort of throughout our last 110 years, certainly in the last decade or two, where we're sort of spending more time in that warmer than average. So we're basically squeezing in an extra month of summer. So increasingly we'll be expecting to have to deal with those increased temperatures going forwards. I just want to give a plug to Dale Gray and the Break newsletter that he puts out with Ag Victoria. So he looks at the Bureau seasonal forecast for the next 3 months, but also he looks at 11 other global forecast models that come from whether it's NASA or the UK Met Office or the European model or the Japanese or the Chinese model. So everyone's out there forecasting. One of the things he does is he looks at all of those each month, and I call it his footy tipping sheet, but he basically looks at a little patch of Victoria and all of their maps and says how many of them are thinking wetter or drier for the next 3 months. And so the current one, he's just done a scan of it. And you can see that of the 12 models, 9 of them are sort of sitting on average, and 9 of them, sorry, are sitting on the drier side of the fence, and only 3 on average. So that's a pretty strong skew to saying it's not just the Bureau thinking drier, and a pretty strong skewing for wetter. Just on the run home here, Clinton, so I'll just point to, if you're after some good local fact sheets on whether the Bureau's just updated there's 4-page local climate fact sheets on explaining longer term history and recent trends for each region of the country. So they're a really good little product to have a look at. And other tool I just want to point out is the Extension Oz site. There's some great stuff there for irrigating agriculture site on Extension Oz, and look up the irrigating agriculture. There's some really good work happening there, and most people will be aware of some of this stuff for the weekly irrigation requirements and things by Rob O'Connor and the team with AgVic that looks at not only recent sort of evaporation rates, but forecast evaporation rates and things like that. So just sort of give them a plug. If you're after any more info, there's an email address for us, or if you see any of those products or want to subscribe, just head to the AgVic website. So I'll leave it there, Clinton.
Fantastic. Look, really appreciate that, Graham. That was a really great overview and some really helpful tools there. A little bit nervous about we're squeezing in an extra month of summer going forward there, but look, it's important to hear that information all the same. I'm just inviting any burning questions for Graham that might have come up from his presentation, any clarification of any of those resources or tools that might be available, any thoughts on any forecasting? Well, we might just leave that open just for one more moment. We might start to hand over to George Warne from RMCG.
Okay, thank you.
So, George, it might have come up on your screen. We can bring up your presentation, but I just wanted to give a plug for John. He's got some great experience with water pricing and forecasting, particularly in the Southern Basin region. He's an associate RMCG, but yeah, George is going to have a bit of a focus on bulk water. I'm going to give George a plug given his wealth of expertise and experience in this space, particularly former roles with Managing Director of New South Wales State Water and as a Director on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. So yours, George.
Thank you, Clinton. I'm sure you can hear me.
Very loud and clear, George.
I was fascinated by that last discussion, and I think the experience of many of us living in the Southern Basin is that regardless of some terrific rainfall events, we're getting drier autumn and drier spring. And I think for a lot of my lifetime, we've had dry autumns, but the dry springs are a relatively new phenomenon. They're causing a lot of grief in a lot of industries, and particularly in respect to this presentation, which talks about irrigation water, which is obviously a function of how much rain you get, and often how much rain you get in spring. So just in terms of this presentation, we're talking about water for irrigating crops with a focus on hort. And my experience is basically limited to the Southern Connected Basin, particularly in southern New South Wales. But I guess for anyone growing a crop, you want to understand your financial budget, and the good news for fruit and veggie growers is you're the top of the tree in terms of what you can earn per megalitre applied. I think we all need to understand our maximum water budget, and these dry springs and dry summers have meant that lots of people are exceeding by up to 20, 30 or 40% their average crop water requirement. And it's not much fun if you're only a few weeks away from finishing a crop and you run out of water. We'll look at some work we're doing on long run water pricing, and we're really talking about allocation water pricing, but I'll also talk about entitlements and what's happening there. And we'll talk at the end, I'll just discuss water entitlement pricing. And I guess you might be looking at this from the context of, should my farm business own more water? How does leasing work? How do annual markets work? The only thing I'd say about any of those things is when it's dry, none of us can think wet, and when it's wet, none of us can think dry. So it's very difficult sitting here in the midst of a terribly dry patch thinking that water prices might fall one day. Just in terms of the products that are out there, in terms of owning entitlements, if you're a horticulturalist and you want to own entitlements, high reliability water entitlements are now trading for up to $10,000 a megalitre for New South Wales Murray high security. That's a product that 10 years ago was worth about $2,500 or $3,000 a megalitre. New South Wales and Murray or Murrumbidgee general security entitlements, $1,500 to $2,500. Annual water allocation or buying water on the market on a daily basis just to buy 1 megalitre for today's crop, prices between $50 and $900, and in some parts of the Murray this year they're at or above $900 a megalitre. Some people prefer to lease allocations from others, and they're paying for between $150 to $350 a megalitre to lease someone else's entitlement, but usually you're taking the risk on the announced allocation. So it's not a perfect hedge, but it's one way of reducing the volatility in water markets. And many of you in the hort industry are interested in groundwater. Unfortunately, where the hort industry and groundwater coincide, there's not much groundwater. There is in the Murrumbidgee Valley, but in the Murray Valley, typically as you get into the sandier, better soils for hort, the groundwater is pretty salty. We've already seen this, and I guess I don't need to tell you guys, it's looking like it's going to be a hot summer. It's looking like it's going to be a pretty dry 3 months. This is 1st December to 1st of March, I think. And the storages, in this particular case, is the Connected Murray storages published by the MDBA, and that's Hume Dam, Dartmouth Dam, Lake Victoria, and the Menindee Lakes. And you can see the low here of 2007 when we really were running out of water, and you can see the dry patch in 2016, and you can see where we are today. It's not as bad as that, but it's certainly very dry. And importantly, when you look at this graph, it would appear that the traditional peak, which occurs in October, November's turn, and we're now heading down again in terms of our active storage. That usually means that the allocations and their water availability for the following year has been set. Now, there are exceptions like when it rained in January, February 2011, but typically the amount of water available in the Southern Connected Basin is really nailed down about now. I guess one of the things we're trying to work out is, are there tools you can use to determine what the water price might be this year? Is the water price that's being offered today good value relative to seasons past? And really a farmer with a crop in the ground or thinking of a crop has got to say, am I better off spending my money now and buying water, or should I wait? And we'd like to think there are some tools that might help people. And finally, I'd added that in all jurisdictions in the Southern Connected Basin, you can carry over unused water from one season to the next. So if you buy too much water and it ends up raining over summer and you don't need it, the water's there for you at the start of the following season. And that's become a very important tool. Really interestingly, it's also a tool that's led to quite a bit of what we call underuse in the basin. For anyone who's looking at a crop, just be really careful to get good data about how much water use per hectare. I was just looking at the ABS data on water use per hectare for different crops and I think they're wrong. I think they're wrong about nearly everything. So this is compared with what we would say to a farmer you should consider allowing. Pasture is probably not a good example because there's so many sorts of pasture. But for cotton, new varieties mean higher yields. Higher yields usually come from faster growing, healthier plants. Healthier plants use more water. And at Colliambly in a normal season, they now look at 9.5 megs a hectare. And I've heard of growers allowing and using up to 12 megalitres a hectare for cotton. Rice production has got better per megalitre. They're certainly using less water than they used to. But for a really big crop of 12 or 13 tonnes a hectare, you might use 13.5 megalitres a hectare. Vine crops can be pretty frugal with water. They're a naturally arid climate crop, but use is very unlikely to be much less than 3.7 megs a hectare. And the nut crops have been the boom crop recently, and in the Hillston area and the Lachlan, they're using up to 16 and 18 megalitres a hectare to get optimal yields out of almonds, and they're claiming that that's all being used by the plant. I'm not quite so sure. Obviously, with growing vegetables, your income's highly variable, but just an example that I've calculated there is you might be looking at a much higher gross income than most other crops being grown in the basin, and that's quite important because they're the people you're competing with for water. RMCG maintains, this is one's a year old, but we've updated it, and we just look at an analysis of every year for every product in the connected basin, how much water has been allocated, how much has been announced, and we've now developed another tool where we go through and look at every one of these products and see how much the environment's purchased, and we take that out of the available water pool in the connected basin. And for most of the time, in most of the years, it has been a connected market, but obviously now with very high use in some sections, there's been some limits put on markets. But that's the basis of some of our thinking. We also then look at the weighted average water price for various different products, but it's pretty much the same. And this is looking at what people are paying for allocation water. And you can see that coming out of the wetter 2012-13, into the drier 2015-16, into the very wet, I think it was the 8th wettest summer in the Murray Valley, 8th wettest spring in July 16, and then we've been getting drier and drier and drier, and we've seen annual allocation prices heading upwards. And some of you will be experiencing that. So from all of this information, we've developed a price curve. We've assessed the average weighted price, and we've used the Murray Irrigation Exchange just because it's not managed by brokers, it's independent. And if water goes on that market, we know it's for sale. We've looked at the combined total maximum allocated in any year for the Murray, the Murrumbidgee and the Goulburn. We've taken out the water available to the environmental water users as coming out of the bucket. We've recognised the allocations usually peak in mid-November, but we've then been able to add projections from New South Wales, SA and Victoria of likely increases in allocation by February in the worst year ever, the 99th percentile, the 75th percentile and the median year. And we add that to our data set. It's been a good indicator and it seems to be working quite well. And as a result, we've developed a graph that looks at those products that are listed there in combination, which is about 7 million megalitres of typically available water in a year of 100% of everything. And this year you can see there's about 2.5 million megalitres been allocated. And you've got to take 21% of that away because that's what's owned by the environmental water holders. And then you relate that to a graph and you look at the seasons. And we might just spend a few minutes on this graph. This is the little blue dots and the year, the average volume weighted price paid on the Murray Irrigation Exchange for the whole year and every year since the mid-1990s on the exchange. And then it's looked at the total amount of water that's been allocated by the end of the season in each of those 5 jurisdictions: New South Wales Murrumbidgee, New South Wales Murray, Vic Goulburn, and South Australian Murray. Importantly, the light blue section on the right, I think, is the land we'll never go into again, because with 20% of the water owned by the environment, if you get a maximum allocation of every product, that's the amount that's going to be owned by the environment. So it's going to be very difficult to go into that space again. Those years have been modified for the actual water available in each of those years, and we started reducing the total allocation by the environmental amount since about 2007 or 8. So in the end, we've ended up with quite a good fit. I think it's got an R squared of 92, which is a pretty good score, which shows that there probably is quite a strong correlation. And then the trick is to say, well, how much water is going to be allocated in this year? And obviously you get better at that as you move through July, August, September, October, November. And now we're at a point where the likely allocation and the actual current allocation are pretty close together. And today's water trading on the Murray Irrigation Exchange at about $632 a megalitre. The total of all water sold on that exchange this year, weighted for volume, is actually just a little bit above the line. So we think the estimated end of season average will be above the line, but probably not much. And it's very, very difficult to tell what drivers are, except we're pretty confident that it's a supply-driven market. That is, the supply drives everything. The important thing for the pessimists out there is to cheer up a bit, because in about 10 or 12 of all those years, the water price has been under $100 a megalitre. And there's good reason to think that prices of $500, $600, $700 or $800 are the anomaly. They're not the new normal. So understanding in water entitlements, moving away from allocation announcements, water entitlements have been growing in value. The good thing about water entitlements for an investor or for a farmer leaving his farm and leaving it to his unreliable son and his evil daughter-in-law is that water entitlements don't rust, or they don't grow weeds, they don't get ruined by the share farmer. Investors are keen on water entitlements. Unfortunately, they're a bit too keen, but certainly we've seen a lot of action of investment organisations moving in to buy water entitlements. Interest rates and returns on a lot of other assets have been very low, so investors are very keen on this new asset class. I guess it's always important to remind anyone that you only make money from water, owning water, by growing an irrigated crop or selling it to someone who's going to grow an irrigated crop. And the important thing we're just looking at now is the per hectare cost of owning water to establish or support an orchard now worth more than everything else. It's more than the purchase of the land, the setting up of the infrastructure, buying the rootstock, establishing the trees. And if you think about 13 megalitres a hectare for an almond orchard, and you wanted to buy 13 megalitres of New South Wales high security, you'd be up for $130,000 a hectare for the water for an orchard that might cost you $45,000 to $55,000 for all other costs. So just shows you just how expensive the water component of setting up an orchard has become. Water entitlements have been going up in price. Importantly, I've been talking about New South Wales Murray high security water. There's actually not much of it. Just remember that in 2008 to 10, water prices for entitlements actually fell. And importantly now, most irrigated crops that are competing for water are in a buoyant phase. The rice price this year, the rice industry offered over $700 a tonne. This is a product that they used to give you $190 a tonne for 12 or 14 years ago. Table grapes have just exceeded $500 million in exports. Wine grapes have staged quite a good recovery. Almonds are trading at a high based on tariffs on American almonds into China and the falling Australian dollar. The dairy industry, despite some of the groaning you hear from the dairy industry, dairy prices are at a record high for butterfat, well over $7 a kilogram. So there are some really good things happening out there in irrigated industry, and that's being reflected in the price that investors and farmers will pay for water. Obviously, when we map water entitlement prices, this is the higher reliability products. We've also got separate graphing of all the lower reliability products, and they've shown pretty steady increases in value. Certainly people who've got that in their portfolio are very happy, and a lot of those are retired farmers, as I said earlier. Thank you, Clinton. Thank you, audience. That's actually a pumpkin crop that my son grew last year at home. We're very interested in the water price, but it's a relatively small input cost into that lease block that he's running there. We're much more interested in what the market might be for pumpkins. But certainly water is a key part of making any horticultural business tick. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that, George. Really appreciate that overview, and really helpful to have a glass half full approach to water pricing, as a bit of a reminder about years that aren't as dry as we are at the moment. Just a reminder, if anyone's got any questions for either Graham, George, or coming up with Kelvin, just feel free to pop them into the question toolbar that would have popped up on your screen, and we can respond to them at the end. But I'm just going to take Kelvin off mute, who's dialing in, so he is there. Kelvin, can you hear us? Hello, Kelvin, you there?
How's that, Clinton?
Fantastic, it's come through. I had a slight heartbeat moment there, Kelvin, that you wouldn't be there for us.
Well, I warned you.
So I'm just going to bring up a presentation that Kelvin's going to run us through. So as that's bringing up, Kelvin, I might open the floor to yourself. Just wanted to flag that Kelvin is a great researcher with Applied Horticulture Research and working on the Integrated Crop Protection and Soil Wealth Project. Also just flagging that Kelvin's provided a good fact sheet on irrigation management in sweet corn you can access via the handouts tab. So Kelvin, that presentation should hopefully have come up for everyone's screen, and I'll open the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Clinton. I'll just warn you, and I think I warned Clinton earlier, I just come from the AHR Christmas party, so this will either be the worst webinar I've given or the best, and you can be the judge of that. So look, thanks to Graham and George for those backgrounds. I can skip through a few slides, but I think most of your veggie growers down there will be aware of the dryness. Although, you know, in some of the key veggie growing areas down in Victoria, it is quite wet. You know, I was down in Craigborn, Kuwiup parts a couple of weeks ago, and you know they've got full dams, and they're looking at a boomer of a summer, if you like, in terms of they're the only ones with any water in the whole country. I can tell you from most of the East Coast, it is bone dry up here. It's pretty chronic. So if you do have some water, you know, you've got the potential to make some big dollars out of it. And I think one of the key messages I give out on this talk is, I'm not here to try and save your water. I'm trying to here to try and make you make money out of that water. So I'm not trying to get you to scrimp on irrigation. It's about actually meeting crop demands. So I'm going to skip through a few of those things on the slide. We know about the forecast and the challenge ahead for the next 3 months. But essentially, once you've committed to putting a crop in the ground, to make the best return and to meet, you've got to meet the crop water requirements to grow the yield, quality, and ultimately the dollars. So what I'm seeing from around the country is growers are putting crops in, and they just do not realise how dry it is out there, both in the soil but also in the demand from the atmosphere. And so they're just not keeping up with irrigation water requirements to meet that crop demand. And as a result, the quality of the product and the yield is just not going to be there. And we know in horticulture that if you skimp and you don't produce those products to spec, you're simply not going to get the returns that you want. The supermarkets are so finicky in terms of their specifications that you really have to be on the mark. So, you know, some of the common mistakes that I see around the country are over irrigation tends to occur in the first phase of the cropping cycle. So establishment through to sort of before the canopy closes tends to be over irrigated. And then after that, you tend to go into under irrigation. We just simply don't put enough water on. The other mistake that's frequently seen is after rainfall events, we all tend to want to go on holiday and not put our irrigation back on, and we leave it too long. So I'm going to show some examples of these further on. The other one in particular is coming out of the dry springs that George has been talking about. You just don't have the moisture in your subsoil. And if you don't have that, then you don't have insurance water. So you might get away with that low subsoil moisture in the early stages of crop development. But once the crops hit full straps in terms of growth and water use, then you've just got nothing in the bank. You've got no insurance policy. And if you don't have that, you know, with the nature of vegetable crops, they just will not yield what you want them to do. You'll lose yield, you lose quality, and you'll lose money. Next slide, thanks, Clinton. So I guess in the beginning is, you know, if you're planting a crop, say in November, it'll be starting to really hit its straps now in terms of rapid growth. So you'll see here a little series of photos of a lettuce crop developing, and it's got down below there the crop factor. So the crop factor is what you use to adjust your evapotranspiration rates that you can get to estimate your crop water use. And so if you look along that slide, it starts off at 0.2 when you've got a bare soil, so just after you've sown or transplanted. They sit there for a few weeks, get up to maybe 0.3s, and then bang, they'll really take off. And in spuds and most crops, they will take off really rapidly. And that's the point you've got to be really looking for, because water use can increase so dramatically at that stage. And it doesn't increase by 10% or 50%. It doubles, it trebles, it goes up by 4 times. So if you're not aware of that, then you can get caught with under irrigating your crop, particularly if you've got no reserves in those subsoils. So when that crop's really growing rapidly, you've got to make sure that your irrigation rates are starting to increase to match that. Below in the little graph below, we've got a little example of a corn crop, and you'll see the rapid growth in the canopy, what we call a crop factor, and you can see in a number of weeks it'll go from 20% of ET up to over 100% of ET, and you've got to be adjusting those figures to account for that rapid canopy growth. So a lot of the products that I see out there in terms of from the Bureau of Meteorology and other evapotranspiration numbers just give you the demand from the atmosphere. They don't put the crop in, and you have to do that. You have to look at to see where your crop's at. So, you know, the key thing here is be ready for big increases in your crop water use when the growth of your crop hits that really rapid phase. And most growers will be well aware of when that's going to occur. Next slide now. This is just a couple of examples of tools that are out there. So, you know, on that theme of be ready for those big increases in crop water use, you can use the 7-day evapotranspiration forecasts available. I've got a couple of examples here. One's from a program called ERISAT, and that gives a 7-day forecast. There's an app called The Yield that'll also give you a 7-day forecast. Be wary again, also these are both of just the demand from the atmosphere. They don't include your crop. So if your crop's still developing, you've got to discount those with a crop factor. The other thing that I'd be point to is that there are slight variations in the evapotranspiration forecasts you'll get based on the calculations. And so the Bureau of Meteorology will give you a lower value than some others, and that's because they use a method called FAO 56, and essentially that assumes that you're growing a grass, a uniform grass sward, and because of that it has some characteristics. The other one, in this case ERISAT, will give you what they call the ETO tall, and that's essentially for a tall crop, but it probably applies more to most of our irrigated vegetable crops because the crops are not uniform across the paddock. So if you think of air moving over a lake or the sea, then the water moves so the air moves very smoothly over that water surface, and there's not a lot of interchange between the air and the water, or the lake in this case. Now, as soon as you create some roughness in that system, that turbulence creates more transfer of water, and that's what we mean by a tall crop. So if you're growing, say, potatoes with hilled up, then that canopy is more rough, what we'd call rough, and so there's more water transfer that occurs. That's why the tall ETO calculation tends to predict better the water requirements of the crop. So just be aware of that, and roughly the difference between, say, FAO 56 that you'll get out of the Bureau of Met and ETO from a tall calculation is about 20%, but it depends a lot on wind speed. So just be wary of those, you will get different rates. If you can go on to the next one. This is about subsoil moisture, which I've mentioned earlier. Essentially, I view this as your crop's insurance. You can go into a crop with a good store of subsoil moisture, and if you get the timing right or the timing wrong with your irrigation, you've still got some insurance there. Or if you get a run of really hot weather where your irrigation system just cannot keep up with the crop demand, you've still got some insurance in that subsoil. So at the moment, as we go into summer, a lot of places don't have a lot of insurance in that subsoil. So make sure you've got some, and if you don't, you've got to put some more water on at the beginning of the crop to try and top that up. So the other point I see on the bottom here is once your subsoil dries down, it's very hard to catch up during peak water demand. Essentially, most of our irrigation systems are designed to meet daily use at peak, and if your subsoil's drawn down, then there's just not enough capacity within that system to put more water down low. So you've got to take advantage of some cooler periods, like and particularly say after rainfall, to try and catch up. And most pivot growers will understand this because their capacity to catch up is fairly limited. Next slide, thanks, Clinton. So monitoring your subsoil, look, there's lots of techniques. They range from, in the broad acre, just going around with a probe to see what's down there. Essentially a dry soil is a hard soil, so you can use that. Using your spade or an auger, or you can go to soil moisture probes. But just whatever you do, have an idea of what you're planting into. I mean, ideally what you want is the plant to be growing into a moist soil, so that basically the water available is increasing as the roots go down and they're finding water down there. If you can do that, it'll make your life a lot easier in terms of managing the crop water use. Next slide, thanks, Clinton. There's just a couple of graphs here I've got. If you go to the rainfall event, that horizontal bar, Clinton, you can just highlight that with your mouse. This is a common issue I see. So this is a soil moisture trace. So moisture on the x-axis and time on the y-axis. Sorry. We've got a little rainfall event, and you can see the growers just reduce their irrigation in the lead up to that rain, and that makes a lot of sense because essentially what you're trying to do is create some space in your soil so that you can make the most of the rainfall event. So you want to just pull back on your irrigation so that if you get a good rainfall, it'll fill up your soil and essentially it's free water. Now, in this case, we got, a 7 mil rainfall event. It wasn't really a lot, but they didn't start up their irrigation again. You can see that it ticks on for 3 or 4 days after, and they're not putting irrigation on. And what is then happening is the subsoil is starting to dry down. So you can see there the trend, that green line at the bottom starts to trend down. And at this point, I'm saying, guys, start irrigating again and catch up. And so it's a really important thing to be looking at is don't get too distracted by the subsoil, the topsoil and what the subsoil is, the topsoil is doing. So the topsoil will be bouncing around a lot because it goes up and down fairly quick with irrigation and water extraction by the crop. But make sure you keep a longer term view of what your subsoil is doing. And you can see there's a trend down, and basically you've got to try and start bringing that back up by adding more water. So there are some key lessons. In terms of using your soil moisture probes. So the key lesson was rainfall. Get your irrigation started again sooner than you think. I know it's nice just to leave it because it's a bit of a holiday, but get back into it. And the other one is keep a longer term view on what your subsoil moisture is doing, and don't let it trend down, because what's going to happen is as your crop starts to get to the business end of the growth cycle, you need that water to supply it, particularly if you're going into the peak demand in January into early February, when we know water use is going to be really high. If you don't have that water in the bank, then you're going to be in trouble. The next one, Clinton, thanks. This is probably less of an issue in this sorts of environment, but it's about just don't waste water through over irrigating as well. Typically we see over irrigation in the early part of the crop, so when crop water use is not that great. You know, you've got a crop factor of 0.2, so you know you discount everything down to 20% in terms of water use. And then people are just putting more water on, and what we see here is the blue line, the topsoil is going up with the irrigation, and you're seeing that water flow through to the subsoil, and basically it's draining out the bottom of the profile. And you've got to also remember that you're taking your nutrients with it as well. So you're trying to avoid that. It's probably less of an issue in this sort of environment where we're just not having a lot of rainfall events. And so we're not coming into summer with a full profile. Probably next one, Clinton. A similar one, and this again is rainfall events causing that deep drainage. I'll probably skip that because it's not so relevant in this sort of discussion. So if you think of this summer, basically we know we're going to go through the summer with a high evapotranspiration rate. The environmental demand or the atmospheric demand peaks around January. You know, we've got windy days, hot weather. They just suck, you know, 10, 12 mil of water out of the crop a day. And if you don't keep up with that, then your crops will suffer in terms of yield and quality. We know based on the forecast that it's going to be associated, that extra heat that Graham talked about is going to increase the ET. So our crops are going to be even more under the pump to supply that. We also know that we're going to go into through summer with low rainfall. And what that does is it puts more emphasis on your irrigation demand or supply. And if your irrigation system is not up to scratch, you will see it, because you don't have rainfall coming across at a regular pattern and resetting your soil. So any deficits you've got in your irrigation system will show up. So you should really be looking at how well your irrigation system is performing in terms of uniformity, etc. The other thing that low rainfall summer will show up is your irrigation water quality. Because again, you're not getting that reset from the rainfall, then any salinity issues you've got in your water supply will come through very strongly in your crop. So that's probably the key messages that I want to give out, is that, you know, it will be a challenging summer. You know, you've got to be really on top of your irrigation. This is the time to focus on it. You can forget about it for 9 months of the year, but the next 3 months is when you really want to focus on it. And if you're going to put a crop in the ground, just make sure you've got the water to irrigate it. Otherwise, you know, do something else with that area. That's all from me, Clinton. Thanks.
Excellent. Really appreciate that, Kelvin. It was a great reminder too, in particular, about the importance of soil moisture in there. We've had a really healthy turnout onto this webinar, so I'm assuming someone has got some burning question they would like to raise. But in the meantime, just in the last few minutes, just if there's any questions of each other of the presenters, if you wanted to clarify any points that were raised, here's a great chance to do so. Putting them here on the spot as they do that, but that's fine. Our contact details will be available with this webinar if there is any particular follow-up anyone does have on any of today's topics. But look, thank you everyone for joining us. It has been great to see the level of interest and turnout we've had for this important topic as we come into the season ahead. Particularly want to pay thanks to Graham, George and Kelvin and everyone who has been able to join us for this discussion. And look, please remember a recording of this will be made available on both the Elders Veg Vic website and also the Integrated Crop Protection and Soil Wealth website as well. Here's wishing to everyone for a hydrated summer ahead. And thank you again for your time. All the best. Cheers.
Thanks, Clinton.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you. I can get back to my Christmas party.